Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we'll continue our reading of Village Affairs by Miss Reed. The last day of term passed off jubilantly, its glory only partly clouded by my secret fears that this might be perhaps the last day of a school year spent under Fairacres School's dilapidated roof. However, I put such dismal thoughts aside and fell to tidying cupboards, dismantling the nature table, removing the children's artwork from the walls, and ruining my thumbnail as a result, as I do regularly. A broken thumbnail and arthritis in the right shoulder, caused by writing on the blackboard, are just two of a teacher's occupational hazards, I have discovered. Increasing impatience over the years seems to be another, certainly in my case. But today, in the golden haze of breaking up, all was well. The children were noisy but busy. The sun blazed down as though it would continue to do so until Christmas. Mr. Roberts' combine provided a pleasant humming from some distant field, and a drowsy bumblebee droned up and down one of the school windows. The afternoon flew by. We stood for grace in the unusually tidy and bare classroom, our voices echoing hollowly, and praised God for mercies received and blessings to come before the tumultuous rush for home. Joseph Coggs was the last to leave. "You want any gardening done this holiday?" he asked in his husky voice. "Why, yes," I said untruthfully. It was plain that he needed occupation as well as a little pocket money. "Can your mother spare you?" I asked, "or should you be helping with the baby?" "The baby goes with her," said Joseph, running a grubby finger along the table edge. "Anyway, the twins does all that right." "Well, if you're sure," I said, making up my mind to have a word with Mrs. Coggs before he came, "then perhaps one morning next week, if it stays fine." "Core," was all he said, but he raised his dark eyes to mine, and unalloyed delight shone from them. I patted his shoulder. I have a very soft spot for young Joseph, and life has never treated him well. Despite that, he has a sweetness of disposition one rarely meets. Things must be pretty grim at home, and pretty tight, too. I should be glad to have him to help, if only to enjoy his obvious pleasure of being of use. "Off you go, then," I said. "I'll call at your house and soon fix things up." He skipped off, and I followed him. The sun had beaten down upon the faded paint of the school door all the afternoon, and it was almost too hot to touch. In the distance, the downs trembled through veils of heat haze, and my spirits rose at the thought of weeks of summer holidays stretching before me. I skipped almost as blithely as young Joseph across the playground toward my home. Chapter 13. Other People's Homes. As promised, I went to see Mrs. Coggs one evening during the first week of the holidays. I knew better, as a country dweller, than to knock at the front door. In most cases, the knocker is securely fastened by layers of paint and the grime of years, except in the case of those once termed gentry, who still have polished knockers on their front doors and use them. The concrete path leading to Mrs. Coggs' back door was so narrow and flush with the wall that it was quite a balancing feat to remain on it. The surface was badly cracked, and here and there an iron manhole cover added to the hazards. Fairacre went on the mains a few years ago, and we seem to have sprouted more covers than taps in the village. At the back door, 3 scraggy chickens pecked idly at the concrete, scattering with a squawk when they saw me, and fleeing to cover among some gooseberry bushes almost hidden in long grass. It was apparent that no gardener's hand had been at work here for many a long year, and I wondered if the council had issued any reprimand about the state of its property. Mrs. Coggs appeared at the door looking like a startled hare. Her eyes bulged and her nose was a-twitch. "I didn't mean to frighten you," I began. She wiped her wet hands on the sacking apron which girt her skinny form and pushed wisps of dank hair from her face. "You best come in," she said resignedly, and stepped over the threshold into the kitchen. I followed her. I nearly stepped straight back again, stunned by the appalling smell. Mrs. Coggs was busy wiping the seat of a wooden chair with the useful sacking apron and had her back to me, so I hoped she had not seen my dismay. The twins, runny-nosed despite the hot day, now came to the door which led into the remaining room where most of the living was done. They looked as startled as their mother and put grimy thumbs into their mouths for comfort. "Clear off," said Mrs. Coggs. "Miss Reed don't want you lot hanging around, and no more don't I." While I was engaged mentally in correcting the grammar of this last phrase, the two little girls sidled past me nervously and bolted into the garden. The toddler, who had been hiding behind the back of the sacking apron, now set up a terrible hullabaloo. Mrs. Coggs sat down at the kitchen table and hoisted him onto it among towers of dirty saucepans, plates, and old newspapers, and a broken colander which seemed to contain a multitude of fish heads. It was this last, I guessed, which contributed the largest and most potent part of the general stench. "It's gone your bedtime, ain't it, lovey?" she crooned, her face suffused with tenderness as she surveyed her youngest, as it had been with exasperation at the sight of the twins only a minute before. I was reminded of mother cats who adore their tiny babies and cuff them unmercifully as soon as they think they should be off their hands. "It was about Joe that I've come," I said. "I wondered if he could help me in the garden now and again during the holidays." She continued to stroke the baby's hair and did not answer. I began to wonder if she were becoming deaf, or if she were still too bemused by her change of fortune to take in anything she was asked. She certainly looked white and pinched, and I wondered if she were getting enough to eat. "Perhaps one morning a week," I said. "He could stop and have his midday dinner with me, if that fits in with your plans." The mention of food seemed to rouse her. "He'd like that. Always likes his school dinners, that one, more'n the twins does. They eats next to nothing." "What do they like?" I inquired. "Bread and sauce," she replied. "They has that most days, saves cooking." I pointed to the nauseating collection of fish heads. "Are you going to cook those?" I inquired tentatively. She surveyed them with some surprise, as though she had only just noticed their presence, although heaven above knew they made themselves felt quite enough. "Fishmonger give 'em to me yesterday and said to boil 'em for soup or summat, but we'd never eat that stuff. I likes tomato out of a tin." I could not probe too deeply into Mrs. Coggs' culinary arrangements, though I was dying to know how she fed the family. Surely they didn't live on bread and sauce exclusively. I returned to Joe's arrangements. "What about Tuesday mornings?" I suggested. "Yeah, that's fine. I goes out all day Tuesday charin'. I takes the baby, and the twins can come too in the holidays, but I usually leaves 'em here out of the way." "That's settled then," I said, making my way to the door and anxious to get a breath of fresh air after the fetid atmosphere inside. Spread over the hedge, I saw some shrunken and torn garments, fit only for polishing rags. Their washing had been sketchy, and they were still stained in many places. The overpowering smell of poverty and neglect saddened me. "Mrs. Coggs," I said, able to bear it no longer, "are you being looked after by the Social Security people? I mean, you are getting money regularly?" Her face lit up. "I gets over £1 for each kid now, and Joe gets £1 too, and there's me own supplementary. I never had so much in me life. We got a telly now." "But what about food?" She looked bewildered. "There's what they likes best. I told you, bread and sauce, and now I buys a few cakes and sweets. We ain't hard up, miss, if that's what's worrying you, and I've got me work." I turned away, sighing. It was quite apparent that Mrs. Coggs' home conditions were the result of lack of management rather than lack of money. I guessed that she was brought up in a home as feckless as her own, and marriage to Arthur could not have helped her. But how sad it seemed, sad and wasteful. "Then I'll look forward to seeing Joe next Tuesday," I said, retracing my steps over the manhole covers. "About 10, shall we say? And I'll send him home about 1 after he's had lunch with me." She nodded vaguely and lifted the child from her hip to the ground where he sat in the dust. His bottom, I noticed, was completely bare. His hand was already reaching for a dollop of dried chicken's mess. I escaped into the lane and picked the first sprig of honeysuckle I could find. It mitigated the reek of fish only a little, but it helped. Amy came to lunch before we both drove over to her late aunt's house, some miles beyond Springborn, to sort out the old lady's things. Still worried about the Coggs family, I poured out an account of my visit. Amy remained unperturbed. "I can't think why you worry yourself so much about other people's affairs," she said. "I imagine Mrs. Coggs muddles along quite satisfactorily. After all, she's still alive and kicking, and the children too, despite her appalling housekeeping." "But it's also unnecessary," I began. "It's purely relative," said Amy, accepting a second helping of gooseberry pie. "I mean, look at the way I could worry myself stiff about you, but what good would it do?" "How do you mean?" I said, bridling. "Well, the slapdash way you go about things. This pastry, for instance. I imagine it's frozen or something like that?" "Of course it is. I make ghastly pastry, and the kitchen floor wants a good scrub after I've done it." "Why, does it taste horrible? You've had 2 helpings, so it can't be too bad." "I was always brought up," said Amy, touching her lips delicately with her napkin, "in the belief that it was excessively rude to comment on the amount eaten by one's guests." "Oh, come off it," I said. "What I want to know is why you compare me with Mrs. Coggs." "Simply this. You worry about Mrs. Coggs because she is so inefficient. I could worry about you because you, in your way, are just as feckless. Fancy spending all that money on frozen pastry when it would cost you about half to make your own." "Don't nag," I said. "All right, I take your point, and I'll try not to get too worked up about the bread and sauce menu at the Coggses. But I shall see Joe gets a decent meal on the day he comes here." We washed up amicably, drank a cup of coffee, instant, apiece, and drove over the hill toward Aunt Rose's establishment. There had been a thunderstorm in the night, and the air was fresh and moist. The road ran between thick woods which gave off a delicious scent of wet leaves and moss. A slight mist hung over the little tributary of the Coggs at Springborn, and a flotilla of ducks splashed happily by the humpback bridge. A magpie flew chattering across the road just in front of the car. "One for sorrow," quoted Amy. "Did you spit?" "Spit? How ignorant you are! You should always spit if you see a magpie alone. It takes the venom out of the spell." "I had no idea you were superstitious." "I'm not, but I do spit at one magpie, and I make a cross in spilt salt, of course, and I wouldn't dream of cutting my nails on a Friday, but I wouldn't consider myself superstitious." "What about walking under ladders?" "Common sense not to. Someone might drop a pot of paint on you." I pondered on the fact that no matter how long one knows people, there still remain depths unplumbed to their makeup. Aunt Rose's house lay some 2 miles along a narrow and twisted lane. A charm of goldfinches fluttered from the high hedges, bound, I felt sure, for some thistle seeds which were growing nearby. A crow was busy pecking at the corpse of a poor squashed hedgehog, victim, no doubt, of a car during its nighttime foraging. It was being watched by a pony whose shaggy head hung over a 5-barred gate. Animals, it seemed, enjoyed each other's company, and were as curious about each other's activities as any of us village folk at Fairacre. The house had a forlorn look as we approached it. The curtains were half drawn and every window tightly shut. It was deathly quiet and still when we went inside, and smelt of dust and old clothes. "Leave the front door wide open," directed Amy, "and let's open a few windows before we go upstairs." It had been built in the 30s, when Aunt Rose's father had died, leaving her comfortably off. It was quite a period piece, and a very pleasant one too, with its cream walls and paintwork, its fawn-tiled hearth, the standard lamp crowned with its beige bell-shaped shade, the oatmeal-colored great knoll settee tied at the corners with silk cord. On the wide window sills stood the sort of flower vases one rarely sees these days, pottery posy rings, a glass bowl containing a heavy glass holder with bored holes, several fine luster jugs. On a little table nearby lay a half-finished piece of knitting in pale blue wool. It looked like part of a jumper sleeve, and a spider had spun a long gossamer strand across its dusty surface. It brought home to me, with dreadful poignancy, the swift transition from life to death, when our toys are set aside and we have to leave our playing. We made our way upstairs, where a smell of lavender greeted us. A bowl of dried flowers stood on the table on the landing and scented the whole top floor. Amy wanted to go through her aunt's clothes before tackling anything else, and we set to with a will. Out of the wardrobe came the sort of clothes which a repertory theater would welcome. There were coats trimmed with silver fox fur, black evening gowns ablaze with sequins at the neck, and a musquash coat from which flew several moths as we dumped it on the bed. On the rack at the bottom of the wardrobe, we removed beautiful cream kid shoes with Louis heels, and some later ones with stiletto heels and sharply pointy toes. Everything was in apple pie order. "Now what I propose to do," said Amy, "is to make 3 piles, one for myself, one for friends and relatives, and one for local jumble sales. Let's make a start." It all seemed very well thought out until we began. Amy's pile was extremely modest. She put aside 2 almost new tweed skirts and a pretty little fur stole. It was division of the rest between relatives and jumble which gave us a headache. Amy proved surprisingly dithery over the allotment. "I think we ought to let the 2 nieces have a look at these woolies. After all, they're practically new and came from Harrods. Perhaps they're too good for the jumble pile." And so they would be transferred, changing places, but only temporarily, with 4 pairs of elbow-length gloves with rows of pearl buttons. My head was beginning to buzz by the time Amy called a halt, and we went downstairs for a change of occupation. Aunt Rose, methodical to the last, had left a list of objects which she wanted close friends to have. Our job was to tie on labels bearing the new owner's name. It was not quite so exhausting as the upstairs sorting, and we duly affixed labels to pieces of beautiful Wedgwood, Venetian glass, a nest of tables, 2 bronze clocks, and a few choice pieces of furniture. I found the job rather sad. It seemed such a pity that all these lovely things, which had lived together cheek by jowl for so many years, should now be parted. But I comforted myself with the thought that no doubt they were going to homes where they would be cherished as dearly as they had been by Aunt Rose. The sky was overcast as we locked up and drove away. "More rain tonight," forecast Amy, dodging a rabbit that sprinted across the narrow lane. "Bang goes any idea of mowing the lawn tomorrow. Can you come again tomorrow afternoon to finish off upstairs?" "I've got Joseph Coggs to lunch," I said, "but I could be ready by 2. "You and your gentleman friends," commented Amy. "I only wish this one were more your age and you took him seriously." She drew up at the schoolhouse and shook her head when I asked her in. "No, I must get back, but 1,000 thanks for helping. I'll see you tomorrow." She let in the clutch and then shouted over her shoulder as the car moved forward, "Give Joe a good lunch." Chapter 14. The Summer Holiday. The clock of St. Patrick's was striking 10 when Joseph Coggs arrived. The sun was beginning to break through the clouds, which had brought more rain at dawn, and gilded the wet paths and sparked tiny rainbows from the droplets on the hedge. My temporary gardener looked remarkably happy. "What you want doing, miss?" he inquired after our greetings. He surveyed the garden appreciatively. "What about weeding the border?" "I likes weedin'," says Joe, accepting a bucket and small fork, but if I don't know which is which, I'll have to holler to you." I agreed that this would be wise and watched him tackle the job. He was quick and neat in his movements, and the groundsel and twitch were soon mounting in the bucket. There's one thing about neglecting a boarder. By the time you get down to it, the results are really spectacular. Joe began to hum happily to himself, and I returned to the kitchen. I had prepared a chicken casserole, and as the oven was in use, I decided to make a treacle tart, for where would you find a small boy who doesn't like treacle tart? With Amy's rebuke still ringing in my head, I resolved to make my own pastry. I must admit I found the task quite rewarding, despite the shower of crumbs which managed to leap from the bowl onto the floor. I found myself becoming quite dreamy as I rolled the pastry. It was such a soporific exercise that I was quite startled when Joe appeared at the open window before me. His eyes were bright as he watched me at work. "Us havin' pie, then?" "Treacle tart." "Core," breathed Joe. He rested his elbows on the outside windowsill and settled down to watch. It was not long before his gaze became as bemused as I guessed my own was. Perhaps it was the rhythmic movement of the rolling pin, I thought. "I loves pastry," growled Joe. "Bein' made, I mean, as well as when I eats it." I nodded in reply and lifted the floppy material onto a shallow dish. "Like sittin' by the fire, or sleepin' with your back against your mum," went on Joe, suddenly loquacious. "You want that bit what's cut off?" "No," I said, handing over a strip. "But should you eat it raw?" "Gives you worms, my mum says," said Joe contentedly, retreating rapidly with his booty. "But I still likes it." He returned to the border, leaving me to ponder on the primitive needs which still make themselves felt, and which had given Joe such unusual powers of expression. The chicken stew was relished as keenly as the treacle tart, and while we were demolishing my handiwork, we chatted of this and that, his next gardening spell with me, why rabbits have so many babies, what happens to your inside if you eat soap, why Mrs. Partridge has summer curtains as well as winter ones, and other interesting topics. "Is our school going to be shut?" he said suddenly, spoon arrested halfway to his mouth. A thread of treacle drooped dangerously tableward, and I steered his hand over his plate. "I don't know. I hope not." "Mrs. Pringle told me Mum was going to." I should like to have said, "Don't believe anything Mrs. Pringle tells you," but civility and the enforced camaraderie of those in authority forbade. "No one knows yet." Joe's dark eyes looked troubled. "Well, I don't want to go off in a bus to that old beach green." "Why not?" Joe twirled his spoon slowly, winding up the treacle. "I'm afeard of that Mr. Annett. He walloped my cousin Fred horrible." "He probably misbehaved," I said primly. "Mr. Annett doesn't punish children unless they've been really bad." "Well, I'm not going anyways," said Joe, looking mutinous. "I hates going on buses away from Fairacre." "Why? Do you feel ill?" "No, but I've been to Caxley sometimes and to Beresford on the outings, and I don't like it. I don't like being so far away." I remembered his look when he described the comfort of sleeping with his back against his mother. "I likes to be home," he sighed. "It's right to be home. It's safe there." The vision of that appalling kitchen rose before me, the stinking fish heads in the colander, the dirty rags on the draining board, the grease on the table, the meals of bread and sauce consumed at that filthy table. But to Joe, it meant happiness. Miss Clare, I remembered, had a sampler hanging on her cottage wall by the fireplace. "Home is where the heart is," it said in cross-stitch. It certainly seemed to apply in the case of Joseph Coggs. And we will go further into the summer holidays next time.